This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by Incogni. Take your personal data off the market.
In 1937, war broke out between the Japanese Empire and the Chinese Second United Front. Japanese aggression against China had begun at least 7 years earlier in Manchuria, but the 1937 battle began 8 years of uninterrupted warfare. The Japanese initially made significant advances, forcing the Chinese to take drastic measures. In 1938, they did something that had been done previously in Chinese history in times of invasion and desperation. They broke dikes and flooded huge sections of their own country. It's history that deserves to be remembered.
The Yellow River has an important place in Chinese history. According to traditional Chinese histories, the first Chinese dynasty, the Xia, originated in the Yellow River Basin when various groups united to combat the river's frequent floods. The fertile land around provided a base for Chinese civilization, while its frequent floods have brought just as much tragedy, including multiple floods that killed more than 1 million people. The river has also been repeatedly used as an instrument of war. In 1128, the northern Song dynasty breached dikes in an attempt to halt invading forces. While it was unsuccessful in stopping the invasion, it did cause massive ecological damage. In 1628, the levees were breached again near Kaifeng, although accounts differ as to whether it was government or rebel forces. Regardless, the breach devastated the city of Kaifeng, killing hundreds of thousands. In 1926, Chinese Kuomintang forces had launched an expedition against warlords in northern China. Retreating warlord forces breached dikes along the Yangtze River, slowing the nationalist advance. Japan and China have long intertwined histories, but their 20th century conflicts can be traced to the Meiji Restoration, when Japan rapidly westernized following their forced introduction to European trade. As Japan began to look for opportunities to expand, China seemed like an obvious candidate, what the Japanese saw as a declining, antiquated empire that was failing to defend itself against the West. This culminated in the 1894 Sino-Japanese War, when Japan suddenly defeated the Qing dynasty, forcing China to give up Taiwan and give up its influence over Korea. China only became more fragmented. The Qing dynasty was overthrown, and the fragmented warlord era ended with nominal but hardly complete reunification under Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, who soon faced conflict with former allies and the Chinese Communist Party. In 1931, the Japanese staged a false flag incident as an excuse to invade Manchuria.
Thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring this episode of The History Guy. Use the link in the description to get an exclusive offer of 60% off. Hey, do you remember the vast majority of history when fishing meant trying to catch actual, fish?
Here's a bit of quick history. In the 1960s, some miscreants figured out that they could scam the phone company by playing tones into the phones and bypass billing systems and get free long-distance calls. Remember when long-distance calls were a thing? The scam was called phreaking, which actually was an abbreviation for free calls rather than a reference to the circus sideshow. But it was spelled with a PH because that's how you spell phone. That became a thing as hackers, new miscreants, started using odd spelling like PH instead of F to avoid internet filters and as a shibboleth for the hacker community. The term phishing was coined by these hacker communities in the 1990s when they were largely scamming AOL users to get credit card numbers. They used the word phishing, with actual fish, as an analogy. They used some bit of information as bait and then called the person to be scammed a fish.
But of course, thinking it made them sound cool, they spelled it with a PH.
Now, phishing, using bait to get us fish to give them information they can use for all sorts of bad things, from straight up accessing your bank account to opening credit cards or even getting home mortgages in your name, is, according to the FBI, one of the top 3 cybercrimes, costing we fish billions of dollars each year. Which is why you need Incogni. Shady data brokers collect data from all sorts of places. Data breaches, which are often accomplished by phishing, but also from public sources, government databases, and even your social media. They then use that information as bait to construct more believable phishing scams that at very least can cost you a huge amount of headache. One vital step to protect yourself from being phished is to take away the bait. Incogni is a great tool that tracks down the data brokers who sell your information and enforces your rights to have the info taken down. I've been using Incogni for years, and according to my handy dashboard here, it has taken my information off of hundreds of sites and saved me over 500 hours of my time that it would have taken me if I tried to do it myself. And that is time I could spend, actually fishing for, fish. And now it's even better. With Incogni's custom removals feature and the unlimited plan and family unlimited plan, you can point to any people search site or other website where your personal information is visible, and one of their privacy agents will take care of the rest for you.
So fight the felonious fishermen. Use the code TheHistoryGuy at incogni.com/thehistoryguy to get your exclusive offer of 60% off. That's the code TheHistoryGuy at incogni.com/thehistoryguy to get 60% off.
From 1931, Japanese and Chinese forces repeatedly clashed. Anti-Japanese volunteer armies formed without government support in Manchuria and northern China. Battle broke out in Shanghai in January 1932, and later that year the so-called Chinese Soviet Republic under Mao declared war on Japan. In 1933, Japan attacked again, seizing more territory as Chinese troops defended along the Great Wall. Through political pressure, the Kuomintang were forced to abandon several other provinces in northern China, which were essentially brought under the Japanese sphere. Despite this constant conflict, Western historians generally consider the Second Sino-Japanese War to begin in July 1937, after skirmishing near the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing turned into all-out warfare. The Japanese, better equipped and with greater numbers, quickly made significant territorial gains. In the 1930s, Nazi Germany was actually on friendly terms with Kai-shek and the nationalist government. The Germans hoped to gain access to raw materials, while the Chinese were seeking modernization and encouraged German investment. Germany actually presented a memorandum that outlined defensive plans for China, which advocated for training a small, mobile, and modern force to replace the very large but poorly trained and equipped army that existed. Trade also blossomed. At one point, Germany accounted for 17% of China's foreign trade, especially in metals like tin and tungsten. Militarily, Germany's greatest help likely came from Alexander von Falkenhausen, who was sent to reform the National Revolution Army. Among Falkenhausen's other contributions to Chinese defense was a war of attrition strategy. He judged that while Japan's forces were superior to Chinese ones, Japan could not sustain a long war. China, he advised, should defend the Yellow River line, allowing numerous provinces to fall while conserving their strength until later in the war. In a report, he also recommended destroying dikes along the Yellow River to flood significant sections of the countryside to slow the Japanese advance. The German assistance to China ended in 1937, when they officially allied with the Empire of Japan. China fought bitterly in the early stages of the war, but Japan made significant gains on multiple fronts. They captured Beijing at the end of July 1937, Shanghai in November, and Nanjing, the Kuomintang capital, in December. Kuomintang forces were essentially defeated everywhere, with the first victory of the Chinese only coming in April 1938. By the end of May, the city of Wuhan was the main Japanese target. Wuhan had become one of the most important economic and military centers in China, so its defense was vital to the Chinese. Also under threat was the Longhai Railway, a vital source of supplies from the Soviet Union and an important junction for the Beijing-Wuhan Railway. The situation for the Chinese were truly dire. Despite the commitment of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the Japanese had continued to advance, killing a huge number of Chinese soldiers and committing horrible atrocities against Chinese civilians. Huge efforts were made to defend Wuhan, but if it fell, the government was prepared to withdraw west into Sichuan, provided it had time. If the Yellow River was diverted, all these resources could be protected, or at least denied the Japanese. The final decision on the strategy was advanced by several important Chinese, including the commander of the First War Zone and the Chinese Minister of War. On June 1, 1938, Kai-shek gave permission to destroy the levees, to use water as a substitute for soldiers. No one in the path of the flood was warned. A week later, on June 8th, press reported that the levees were going to be breached. A dike or levee is an elevated embankment, often man-made, that is built to prevent a rising river from flooding the surrounding countryside. According to journals from the officers in charge, the atmosphere was tense. The river itself had already become the front line, and Japanese soldiers lay nearby while the efforts were underway. The destruction altered the course of the entire river, hundreds of miles south, and then sent destructive floods across China. The first attempt was made between June 4th and 6th. A tunnel was dug into a dike, explosives were set, and a failure. The engineers had chosen a poor site where the dike was particularly rocky. A second attempt was made at another site on the 7th, which also failed. A third attempt was finally made to the west of the first two sites, where soldiers simply shoveled and chiseled away at the dike until water finally broke the riverbank on June 9th. The Chinese immediately began a propaganda campaign about the breach, bringing in professional filmmakers to create an elaborate lie. According to their first announcement, the breach was caused by the Japanese bombing. The film showed desperate Chinese attempting to seal the breach. A report in the New York Times on June 15th claimed that there were numerous levee breaks west of Kaifeng and that Chinese soldiers were firing on the Japanese and impressed peasants in repair parties. Later reports said multiple breaks had coalesced into a single 400-meter-long gap through which about 90% of the river's flow escaped. Reports in the ensuing days ran wild. One Japanese report initially claimed that 150,000 people were drowned, while a Chinese report claimed that 6,000 Japanese soldiers had drowned. Later reports quickly proved that the loss of life was comparatively small, but as the flood spread, more and more villages were inundated. A June 17th report claimed that 300,000 Chinese were already forced from their homes by the flooding. The season was also reported as unusually rainy, exacerbating the already destructive flood. Reports claimed that the Japanese had been warned of the action, but had been unable to prevent it. The New York Times reported that Chinese interviewed in Shanghai supported the action if it could stop or slow the Japanese invasion. American newspapers also reported that the Japanese advance was forced to halt completely where the river had flooded their way forward. In a semi-official account, the Chinese reported the flood gave them 5 months for combat readiness. One American account called the forced redeployment of troops a great expense. A report in the Australian Adelaide Chronicle claims that the Japanese admitted that they were powerless against the floods. The Chronicle's estimation was fairly typical of Western assessment, citing a British correspondent in Shanghai who said that some foreign military quarters think that the Yellow River floods may prove one of history's greatest defensive measures, proving as disastrous for the Japanese as the burning of Moscow for Napoleon's Grand Army. The success of the action on a strategic scale, however, was not as dramatic. It did accomplish several goals, protecting the lifeline of equipment from the Soviets and halting one front of the Japanese advance. Perhaps more importantly, it forced the Japanese to approach Wuhan from only one direction, likely delaying its capture, and denied the Japanese use of large sections of rail, preventing them from using it to press their advance. The most important accomplishment might have been blocking the Japanese army from the best and easiest approaches into Sichuan, essentially preserving the nationalist government as it withdrew. It also allowed some isolated success. Units of the Japanese army, including the 16th Division, were isolated and attacked, forcing those units to withdraw and regroup. Some equipment was lost, though few Japanese were actually killed by the flooding. Some Chinese units were also isolated. The area flooded was also essentially denied to the Japanese, even as floodwaters receded. In many areas, no government, Chinese or Japanese, was in place, and the region became a major base for guerrilla warfare spearheaded by Chinese communists. It did not, however, save China, and Wuhan fell in October 1938. By far the most serious consequence of the flooding was the destruction of civilian areas. Thousands of villages and towns were flooded, some for many years, and the destruction of agricultural land and food supplies was devastating. Exact numbers of those impacted and those drowned are spotty and uncertain even today. In 1943, Kuomintang forces estimated that 12 million people lived in the impacted area. More recent estimates put that number around 5 to 6 million. Official reports were compiled in 1948, which claimed that over 800,000 deaths and at least 2 million refugees. Estimates of those that drowned vary, with a 2015 estimate of 30,000 and the Chinese Academy of Sciences estimating 89,000 drowning deaths in 1995. In the 1950s, the Communist government estimated deaths from the flooding to reach 500,000, while more recent government publications put the number closer to 1 million, as the CCP has used the event as propaganda. The Kuomintang portrayed the loss as patriotic, a symbol of the sacrifices the Chinese people were willing to make in the face of the invasion. It is understandable that the figures vary. There was no systematic attempt at counting the dead or displaced at the time, in areas devoid of any government. By the time anyone could make estimates, it was years after the fact, and the propaganda campaigns of those involved complicated objective measurements. The flood also contributed to a series of disasters that included the war, drought, locusts, and corruption that caused a major famine in Henan province in 1942 and 43. In 1949, one report concluded that nearly 2 million acres of good farmland had been taken out of production. Even in the days immediately following the flood, journalists reported locals eating tree bark. Anthony Garneau, an Australian historian, estimated the deaths at under 1 million, likely around 700,000, while an official count of more than 1.4 million included an estimated decline in births and outward migration. The numbers are uncertain, but the fact is that many thousands were drowned and at least hundreds of thousands more died in the aftermath. The flood may have been decisive in turning peasants in the area to the communists, as the region remained under communist control during the Chinese Civil War that followed the defeat of the Japanese. The flood continued to be a topic in the post-war as the nationalist government attempted to repair the damage to the dikes with the help of the UN. Infighting between the UN, Kuomintang forces, and the communists slowed repairs, and when the dikes were finally rebuilt, civilians who had moved into the old river valley were again displaced. Communist forces led armed resistance to the repairs, using the attention to claim the nationalists were inhumane and willing to kill thousands of peasants to accomplish their goals. The propaganda battle over the repairs was significant in turning public opinion against the nationalist government.
The Yellow River flooding is generally fairly sparsely covered in histories of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and even less so in coverage of that front in the Second World War, which was so sparsely covered here in the West. Whatever its strategic value, it caused a huge humanitarian disaster that affected the trajectory of modern Chinese history. Its tactical value was dubious. The Japanese army already had very stretched supply lines at that point. It's not clear whether they would have been able to move immediately on Wuhan anyway, but any strategic effect certainly doesn't negate the incredible level of human suffering that was caused in a deliberate act that was a desperate gambit, a nearly forgotten disaster in a war of so many disasters. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.